out of, or drive stupidly and get stuck. You've got to concentrate, and you've got to think and plan ahead to anticipate events. That means planning the best route, being in the right gear, and driving at the right speed. You must always be in control of the vehicle. Once the wheels start to spin or slide, you've lost it. And if you don't regain control quickly, the situation can soon get out of hand. A golden rule here is to drive with the accelerator pedal and use the clutch and the brake to an absolute minimum. Here are some typical situations you may be faced with and how you should handle them. Take sand or mud, for example. For these conditions, you need to engage the diff lock before you start to get maximum traction and as high a gear as you think it'll take, because you don't want the wheels to start spinning. Then cross the difficult stretch on a steady throttle. Don't try hard acceleration. The engine's torque will start the wheels spinning. The grip goes and the wheels start to bury themselves. A similar technique will get you through ice and snow and across wet grass. Just use sufficient engine revs without labouring. Don't turn the steering wheel violently, and if you have to brake, do it with care. By the way, one trick you can use if you think a crossing will be difficult is to let some air out of the tyres first. But if you do, don't forget you must blow them back up again before you go on-road. Remember, underinflated tyres will overheat on the road. This will adversely affect vehicle control and could lead to a blowout. Where did he go wrong here? Probably in the wrong gear and too much welly. It's a very steep climb, so plan ahead how you're going to make it. Always try to go straight at the slope rather than diagonally across it. If you do that, you may also lose control because the vehicle will try to slide down or even roll over if it's steep enough. Is the ground reasonably dry or hard? If so, low-range second or third gear is probably the answer. Ideally, you want to climb in the highest gear it'll take. But if you choose too high a gear, you'll probably stall, and that's bad news on a hill like this. Build up a fair speed on the approach to the slope, so that if it drops off, you'll still have sufficient momentum. Once on the slope, delicate use of the accelerator is necessary to try to eliminate wheel spin. But if the wheels do start to spin, don't floor the accelerator. That will only make things worse. You'll probably start to slide sideways off course. If it's slippery wet grass or mud, ensure the diff lock is engaged for the extra traction it'll give you. But whatever you do, make your mind up before you start and stick with it. Never try to change gear halfway up. You'll probably stop or stall the engine and the vehicle will want to slide back. If you stall, never try to freewheel back down. You'll lose control. If you get it wrong, stop. With the ignition off, hold the vehicle on the handbrake and foot brake. Put the vehicle in reverse, release the handbrake, then gently release the foot brake. The vehicle is now held on the braking effect of the engine. Now turn on the ignition. You will start with a jolt, but then be taken back down the slope under control of the engine braking. All you have to do is steer. Then try again. Coming down a slope can be just as tricky as going up, or even trickier, because you may not even be able to see the steepness of the ground over the bonnet as you approach it. Stop a vehicle length before you get to the edge, and if necessary, get out to have a look. Select low-range first gear with the diff locked. Let the clutch out and allow the vehicle to descend the slope without touching the clutch or brakes or the accelerator. Let the engine do the braking. Don't try to brake or you'll start to slide and lose control. If the vehicle does slide, very gentle use of the accelerator will get it back under control again. And, just like going up a steep slope, always come straight down, never diagonally. If you do have to traverse a slope, so much depends on its steepness and the hardness of the ground. But if it's steep and slippery, you'll slide sideways towards the bottom. So the first thing to do is to decide whether it's worth trying at all. Crossing ridges or ditches or driving through gullies can make it difficult to keep traction. The excellent Land Rover suspension design allows the wheels to adopt amazing angles to maintain contact with the ground. But obstacles like this do require a bit of thinking out by the driver. Approach it straight on, and the front wheels can drop so far that the vehicle will be stopped. Approaching at an angle in low range with the diff locked can make all the difference. 3 of the 4 wheels will always be on flat ground while you cross, and traction will be maintained. Incidentally, the least ground clearance is between the ground and the 2 differential casings. They're located under the driver on right-hand drive Land Rovers and under the passenger on left-hand drive. So, a useful tip is to remember their positions and line yourself up accordingly if you have to steer over large stones or protruding rocks. In deeply rutted tracks, the one thing you don't have to worry about is steering the vehicle. It'll do that for itself. But obviously, you still have to think about the ground you're going to cross and drive accordingly. Don't overlook the potential loss of ground clearance below the axles, because you could leave yourself stranded. If that happens, a useful tip here is to turn the wheels slightly from side to side and use the tyre sidewalls to get traction on the vertical edges of the ruts. We haven't mentioned wading yet, but here too there are important points to remember. The first is to fit the wading plug before you start. It stops water and mud getting onto the clutch, but it shouldn't be left in permanently. If the water's too deep, it can get to the electrical system and into the engine's air intake, with immediate serious engine damage. And you can cause the same problem by going into shallow water too fast. Yep, that was a pretty stupid bit of driving, wasn't it? He had no idea how deep the water was, and it could have gone into the engine, causing it to seize. Also, the vehicle could have been badly damaged, and worse still, he could have caused injury to himself and to his passenger. And all because of a total lack of forethought. If you don't know the water you have to go through, it may be necessary to do a recce on foot to find out how deep it is. But in any case, stop before you get to it, select diff lock low range, and a gear which will enable you to keep the revs up, and drive through steadily. In deep water, keep your speed down to about 3 miles an hour to avoid creating too big a bow wave, and make sure you don't stall or water will go up the exhaust pipe. Slow and steady is the way to get through. And don't forget, when you've reached the other side, drive a short distance with your left foot on the brake pedal to dry out the brakes. Otherwise, the next time you need them, they may not work too well. If you're crossing a river, it's best to aim slightly downstream. If you go upstream, a strong current may drown your engine. But however you tackle it, always decide where you can exit the river before you start. Oh, and yes, if you're going through water in convoy, don't get too close to the vehicle in front. The wash he makes may drown your engine too. Here's a few more tips for off-road driving. Your new Land Rover has a much more powerful engine in it than the last one. So, it'll be much easier to get wheel spin if you over-exercise your right foot. The power is there when you need it, but use it with care. It's all too easy to get wheel spin. Make sure you don't have your thumbs wrapped round the steering wheel, particularly when you're driving off-road. You suddenly hit a major obstacle, kick back through the wheel could give you a nasty thumb strain or even break it. Keep your foot well away from the clutch pedal when you're not actually changing gear. If you don't and you hit an unexpected bump, you can declutch inadvertently and lose control. Keep braking to a minimum, and heavy braking is out altogether. On mud, wet grass, snow or steep downslopes, you'll lose grip, start sliding, and you're immediately out of control. Use the engine to provide braking on a downslope. And similarly, heavy use of the accelerator pedal under these conditions can cause wheel spin and loss of control. Make sure you can pass through tight areas by being aware of the vehicle's dimensions, height, width and length. And by the way, in tight spots you can judge distances more accurately by keeping to the right. Less obviously perhaps, you must be aware of the approach, departure and ramp angles of your vehicle. As you can see, these are the clearances you have at the front, rear and underside, and the maximum angles of the obstacles that you can clear without grounding. And don't forget the effect your driving techniques can have on the environment. Heavy braking and hard acceleration all play their part in polluting it. To sum up off-road driving, there are few hard and fast rules, because each situation has to be assessed on its merits. But see how you can measure up to this. Never change gear or operate the clutch while you're going through a difficult patch of ground. Make your mind up about gear selection before you start and stick with it. From then on, the only pedal you should use is the accelerator. Experienced off-road drivers look and plan ahead. They drive smoothly. They treat loose or wet surfaces as if they're ice and do everything gently. Smooth, slow throttle operation to keep the tires from spinning on acceleration and from locking on deceleration. They use precise steering and they remember the golden rule. Drive with the accelerator pedal and use the clutch and brake as little as possible. The experienced driver always controls the vehicle, never the other way round, by driving as slowly as possible, but as fast as necessary. Done that way, they get through. Can you? Anticipate by looking ahead for potential hazards and thinking ahead. Prepare to drive accordingly by selecting the route and the right gear ahead of time. Remember the specific technique you need to cross that type of obstacle and drive through or over it accordingly. Keep in control at all times. If you lose it, you may have more than just a red face. As part of the MOD's and Land Rover's commitment to environmental protection and to reduce the emission of greenhouse gases and harmful particulates, you must drive in a way that protects the environment. The techniques for drivers to minimize fuel consumption through better driving are summarized in Standing Orders for Drivers, JSP 341 Part 4. These techniques offer significant financial savings in reduced fuel consumption, in addition to assisting the MOD to meet its demanding targets for reducing harmful emissions. Your training will have taught you to drive safely. These actions will help you to drive safely and economically. By the way, a final thought before we finish. We talked earlier about the powerful engine fitted to your new Land Rover. It's turbocharged, and turbos turn at incredible speeds, well over 100,000 revs per minute. And this means that their bearings must get plenty of pressurized oil from the engine. This oil drains from the bearings when the engine's stationary. So when you start up, let the engine idle for a few seconds before revving it. Well, this will allow pressurized oil to get to the turbo. Equally important is switching off. If you rev the engine and immediately switch off, the engine will stop, but the turbo will continue to spin while it slows down. The result can be damaged bearings and an expensive turbo replacement, because when you switched off the engine, the supply of pressurized oil to the bearings was immediately cut off, long before it stopped turning. So, always allow the engine to idle for a few seconds before turning it off. Well, that completes this program. We've shown you techniques for both on-road and off-road driving to help you get the best out of your Land Rover. There's been a lot for you to think about, and you may want to watch this video again, either now or later. But the proof of the pudding is to try and put into practice the things we've shown you, to make you a safer, more proficient driver. Maybe one day you will justifiably be able to call yourself an experienced driver. Good luck.